look at portraits of George Washington made during his lifetime and shortly thereafter, and to compare them with the portraits of King George III. King George III, of course, was the King of America before George Washington became the first president. And in the pictures, you will see the same motifs. They look remarkably similar to each other, albeit George looks rather more overweight and less healthy, and George Washington looks a little younger and fitter. But you will find a navy blue coat, a naval hat, golden epaulets, a staff, a sword, a Roman mace and eagle, which were the symbols of power in the Roman Empire, disguised as a table leg, white powdered wigs, crowns and flags in the background, gold braid and lots of gold. And all those objects are vested with associations of power and authority. And the fact that they're all in the portraits and they're so similar is really a message that though we now have a president and not a king, the president has all the same kinds of power. It's the same kind of power that has passed from the old regime to the new regime. In the Bible, we find vested objects as well. The Ark of the Covenant, containing Aaron's staff. Aaron, the number one officer to Moses, has this staff of office that can do amazing and magical things. And there's a jar of manna that recalls Yahweh's supernatural power to generate food and keep his people alive. There is the Nehushtan, which is the bronze image of the serpent, which the people had to kowtow to because otherwise they'd die, because Yahweh was punishing them for complaining about their emergency rations and being too hungry. And then there's the Urim and the Thummim, which are devices for obtaining guidance from a Yahweh who's no longer on the planet's surface. These are vested objects in the Hebrew stories. They represent the right to rule over the tribes of Israel, which is why enemy powers tried to steal these objects. And so the story is told of what happened to them when they stole our vested objects, and how the totem of their powerful one fell down and broke, and how they all got sick when the vested object was in their community and they had to send it away on a cart carried by 2 oxen so that the tribes of Israel could have their holy objects back. But what's curious about those objects is that they may be the vested objects of a previous civilization. Why do I say that? Because it's quite clear that neither they nor the writers of the Hebrew scriptures knew how these objects worked or what they really were. We have details for constructing an ark, and we're told that it's a communications device, but we're not told how it works. We're told that it can create vortices of wind, but we're not sure how. We're told that if you touch it, you'll get electrocuted and die, or if you go near it, you'll get radiation sickness, but we're not sure why. We're told that the Urim and Thummim can be used for getting some kind of guidance, some kind of remote communication going with Yahweh, but we're not told how. And I would suggest that this is because those who came before knew how to operate those things, whether we're talking about a previous human civilization or the ET visitors who instituted the practices surrounding these objects. So the objects remain, they still hold their association with power, but no one quite knows how they work anymore. So we have these objects that symbolize the passage of power. So presumably Yahweh hands over things to his successor when he's deposed, and King Saul has them. Saul now has the power, right? And then when Saul commits suicide, his successor David now has the power, right? And the kings have the power. Is that right? Not right. When Saul does something that Yahweh would not have done. And what it was is he waged war more mercifully than Yahweh would have waged it. He wins the battle. He defeats the military. What Yahweh would have done was to kill every man, woman, child, and animal and leave only scorched earth. And when Yahweh sees that Saul is running things differently, he deposes Saul. And if that weren't bad enough, he infests him with some kind of archonic entity to make him mentally ill and drive him to suicide. And then he's replaced by David, who, as we know, was somebody quite happy to use murder for his own personal pleasure. A man after my own heart, says Yahweh, until David does something Yahweh doesn't like. Yahweh wants a king who will go to war at the drop of a hat just because Yahweh says, I want you to defeat those infidels down the road. What David does is he counts his troops to make sure that he only embarks on winnable wars. And Yahweh doesn't want his orders questioned like that. It's not if I can do it, it's yes, sir. And so David is punished. He is allowed a merciful punishment, which is the slaughter of 70,000 of his own infantry. Yahweh kills them. These aren't rebels. These aren't insurgents. These aren't infidels. These are his own soldiers who he kills just to show what happens when you think for yourself. And then we have Ahaziah, again, one of Yahweh's own kings. He wants some medical advice from another powerful one, the powerful of Ekron down the road. And Yahweh is so offended that his own king doesn't think he, Yahweh, is smart enough to do a proper prognosis, that he pronounces a death sentence over his own king. And so here we have this message of don't think for yourself. Do what you're told. And that applies whether you're a citizen or a king. And that's become our idea of righteousness and sin through the whole of Christian history. That's what we think righteousness is, doing what we're told. And sin is doing what God doesn't want. And we've lost all agency to think for ourselves and weigh things up, whether the thing is good or bad. It's that knowledge of good and evil that the senior Elohim in Genesis 6 didn't want humans to have. The senior Elohim in Genesis 3, the story we call the fall, wants humans kept at an animal level, so unintelligent that we don't even know we're naked. This is the Yahweh character in Genesis 3, although that name's been superimposed. He wants humans that can be trained. They will do the right thing because if they do the right thing, reward. If they do the wrong thing, pain. That's how we train animals. And that's what he wanted for us. Whereas the serpent said, no, they need to be conscious. They need to be aware. This is not a happy existence for them. And so he does the upgrade. That's the Genesis 3 story, which repeats in narratives all around the world. But it's not just about models of goodness, sin, righteousness. This is about covert government, isn't it? Because the people thought they'd got rid of Yahweh and replaced Yahweh with a human king, Saul, one of their own, to pursue policies for the common good. Except the body sitting on the throne has changed. The face fronting up to the public has changed, but lurking in the dark in the corridors of power is Yahweh, still calling the shots. When it doesn't go his way, there will be consequences. Same with David, all the way through to Ahaziah. And so what the Hebrew narrative tells us is that just because the position holder has changed, doesn't mean everything has changed. Just because you have a new king, doesn't mean the system's changed. Just because you've gone from a monarchy to a democracy, doesn't mean the powers behind the throne have all disappeared. Just because you have a new boss doesn't mean that the dynamics at work are going to be any different, or the ethics of business will be any different, because you'll still be doing business with the same other businesses. And this reflects in our own world, doesn't it? You can have a general election, a change of government, but if those who are providing the financial incentives to the people in power are the same, what's going to change? And we've seen in elections in Australia and certainly in Britain, where major corporate interests have given major financial incentives to both sides, so that whoever wins the election, the policies will run in their favor. Now, all that insight was there in the Bible when you read it through the lens of paleo-contact. When you realize that 1 Samuel 8 isn't a rebellion against God, it's a rebellion against colonization by a foreign power, an ET power, these political lessons become very clear. Suddenly you're going to be concerned who's got the vested objects. Suddenly you'll be concerned, is covert power still being exercised by the old regime? Because you can read it in the stories. And you will look out for it in the present when our ancestors have explained the dangers to us. But all these warnings, all these lessons disappear the moment you think Yahweh is God, and El Shaddai is God, and El Elyon is God, and the Elohim means God. All these pieces of information, all this insight, all this wisdom being offered by our ancestors becomes hidden. Was it deliberate? Was it accidental? Maybe a little bit of both. And it relates to the final redaction that produced the Bible as we know it. There's a very broad scholarly consensus that this final edit was done in the 6th century BCE on an ideological agenda to teach monotheism. And so a very disparate bunch of scriptures and scrolls were gathered together and reworked into a single piece to teach monotheism. And anything in those texts that ran in a different direction had to be obscured in some kind of a way. I'm going to give an example of how we know that and what that burial of information really amounted to. I'm going to take you to Tel Arad in the Levant in the 7th century BCE to a harvest festival. Here we are in this beautiful city of Tel Arad. It's full of music and dancing. Everyone is joyful today. It's celebration. There are tables in the streets with food, and in particular, scones, wheat cakes, that are a celebration of wheat, food, farming, agronomy. And these are carried and these are eaten in procession with incense burning and people holding clay-baked dolls or figurines of the Queen of Heaven. And we will go and we will show honor to the standing stones where we first met the Queen of Heaven. And then we'll go into the temple for a ceremony where the high priest will preside over the ceremony. Hold on a minute, you're thinking. What? Sorry, Tel Arad, is this Judaism? Because it doesn't sound much like Judaism. Standing stones, Queen of Heaven, temple at Tel Arad, high priest at Tel Arad. There's only one high priest, isn't there? And he in Jerusalem. There's only one temple, isn't there? And that one in Jerusalem. There's only one giver of the harvest, and that's Yahweh, God, isn't it? This doesn't sound like Judaism, except it was. It was Judaism all throughout the country. At that time, Judaism was a practice that involved many temples, many high priests, many gods or powerful ones, including the Queen of Heaven. And the Queen of Heaven was known as Asherah, Astarte, Elat, Hathor. The Romans called her Venus. The Greeks called her Aphrodite. She was the Lion Lady. In Sumeria, she was Shamhat. In Mesoamerica, she was Hunhunapu. The Zulu people remember her as Babwana Warisa. And if you look at your little clay figurine, you'll see that she has bouffant hair and is bare-breasted. And who she is the giver of agriculture, the nurturer of humanity, the one who taught us how to move from animal subsistence to the ability to farm and build cities and become a civilization. She is the mother of civilization. Now, that might not sound like Judaism, but it was in the 7th century BCE. And there are references to this all throughout the canon, but I'm going to read to you from the book of Jeremiah, which says this, and this is describing their worship a century later in the 6th century BCE. Sorry, before in the 8th century BCE. Jeremiah says this, the Israelites worshipped. Now, what do you think he's going to say? The Israelites worshipped Yahweh, didn't they? No, apparently not. The Israelites worshipped other powerful ones. The Israelites spoke disparagingly of their powerful one, Yahweh. What? Wasn't it the other way around? Apparently not. The Israelites spoke disparagingly of their powerful one, Yahweh. They built high places, i.e. temples, in every place they lived, not just Tel Arad. From every watchtower to every fortified town, they set up standing stones and asherahs on every high hill and under every green tree. Standing stones, we know from the practice of Jacob in the Bible, and other cultures around the world are erected to commemorate places of contact with higher beings. And it was the case here. These standing stones say, this is where we were when we first met Asherah. This is where Asherah appeared in this town. This is where Asherah appeared in this community. And so here we have a little encapsulation in Jeremiah of the 8th century BCE, where the memory of Yahweh is negative. It's a memory of colonization, as I spoke of before. No wonder they had negative associations. And a positive memory of Asherah, who they are honoring on every high hill and under every green tree. So the redactors in the 6th century BCE can't leave it like that, because the scriptures are supposed to teach monotheism using the holy name the Jews now used for God, which was Yahweh. So somehow they had to try and make Yahweh look better and Asherah look worse. And how did they do this? They did this by never passing judgment on Yahweh's actions, no matter how brutal they were. And they were brutal because they took the name Yahweh and put them over the stories of other Elohim back in the time before Yahweh had even appeared. So Yahweh actually has to carry the can for a lot of entities who were doing violent colonization. But they would report that with no moral judgment on what he's doing. Whereas with Asherah, who is mentioned 40 times through the scriptures, they are going to add some kind of a gloss, some kind of a comment to indicate Asherah bad. And I don't know if you're at all familiar with an English book called 1066 and all that, but they sort of lampoon this style of history, where the writer will say, so-and-so was a very bad king, and what he did was very bad. He was worse even than all his ancestors. And you get exactly that kind of comment when the Bible has to concede that Solomon built a temple to Asherah. Whoops, we better make a little footnote that that wasn't a good thing. That's kind of how it rolls. And so the memory of paleo-contact is obscured, and monotheism is endorsed. And this whole layer of memory of paleo-contact, the knowledge of who we are, who our cosmic neighbors are, these political lessons in social progress and evolution, all gone, all lost. Never mind about that, because all the people need to know is there's only one God, and it's the Jewish God. And so that's where the redaction took us. So where does our help come from? Well, the stories of paleo contact are many and diverse all around the world, and the same applies with the paleo contact stories in the Hebrew canon. Where did our helper Asherah come from? If you go to Tel al-Farad, which was the capital of the northern kingdom in the 9th century BCE, you can find an engraving of a naus. Now, these can be found throughout the Levant, and what a naus is a doorway with no building. It's a doorway, there's nothing behind it, and there's nothing at the side of it, but in the doorway, a being appears. And the being appears in this naus, in Tel al-Farad, the being of Asherah. Now, what do we call a doorway that has nothing behind it, but people can come through it? Don't we call that a portal? If so, does it tell us anything about where Asherah came from? Clearly, she was an advanced being. She lifted humanity, or the being she represents, lifted humanity from animal subsistence to civilization builders. So where did she come from? There's a little clue on the naus to be found in Tel al-Farad, the symbol of a crescent moon and the stars of the Pleiades. Now we might say, oh, that's just a random decoration, if it weren't for the fact that there are many other cultures who identify the Pleiades as the source of the beings who came and taught our ancestors agronomy. Listen to the Cherokee people, they will tell you exactly the same. And they carry a memory of their arrival in objects that look like eggs, which landed, people came out and sat with their elders and taught all the things that Asherah taught in those stories. But this was all to be forgotten. And I'll see if I can find one final quote here. I can't, so I'll tell you by memory that there was a cleanup in the 7th century BCE of all this liturgical practice. All these harvest festivals honoring Asherah and other beings had to be gotten rid of. And so those clay figurines were smashed, broken, decapitated. The standing stones were knocked down. The other altars were broken. They were going to clean everything up. So there was only one temple left, the temple in Jerusalem. Only one useful high priesthood left, the one in Jerusalem. So there's a great centralization of power of the religious society of the Jewish world. Everything centered on the one family in Jerusalem, the high priestly family, and the monarchy, as long as the monarchy endured. Instead of many temples, one. Many priesthoods, one. All the power, all the tithes, all the taxes going to the center. And then a century later, the redactors did to the scriptures what Josiah had done to the ritual practice, cleaned it up and tried to get rid of all the memory of the Hasayim. This was the text I was looking for. Getting rid of all the symbols of the Hasayim. And that word means the armies that came from the sky. Well, I think it's a shame that we lost this knowledge. And it means that by the time we get into the New Testament, and by the time we're reading 1 John 4, where the writer clearly expects the early Christians to be experiencing helpful contact with other kinds of being, the knowledge of who and what those other kinds of being are has been lost. He doesn't seem to know. He knows there's contact, he knows there's useful information, but he's not quite sure who or what these spirits are that are communicating. And by spirit, we don't mean a disembodied entity necessarily. We don't necessarily mean a physical entity that communicates remotely, because in some cultures, a spirit was simply an entity that could show up in your room just like that and disappear just like that. So the experience of contact was still there, but the knowledge of who we were in contact with had been obliterated. But before our ancestral narratives became fiction, the knowledge was there. Before the Bible became a book about God, the knowledge was there about our deep past and our present and our future. The knowledge was there as to where our help comes from if we want to progress to a better human experience. And if we do the work of going to root meaning translation, which is what all my books are really about, we discover that our ancestors wanted us to know about our power as individuals, our higher cognitive powers, wanted us to understand our power in solidarity when we work together, our power when we reject fear, our power when our love for our brothers and sisters exceeds our loyalty to those over and above. This is our power to progress. They wanted us to know the pain of colonization so we could recognize its patterns in the present. They wanted us to know about the dangers of covert government so that we could ward against it. They wanted us to understand there is an invisible ET layer to world politics, just as there was in the time of Saul and David and Ahaziah. They wanted to understand that we can enjoy contact with ET neighbors that is positive and nurturing, both in the deep past and to provide help in the present. All these lessons are available today if we are willing to listen again to stories we may have dismissed as fictions and fables. All these lessons are available to us if we're willing to dig a little deeper in translation and get to the root meanings of key words. Because if we do that, we will find a whole other layer of understanding available to us, which can transform our lives in the present. So I'll pause there and say thank you for listening. And Neil, looking forward to getting into some Q&A.
Paul, brother, I'm almost speechless, man. That presentation was beyond incredible. Your research is seen. You are so appreciated. What you just did there, it was next level, seriously. And, I've heard a lot of this information, but the way you just broke it down is something I've never heard before, and just put so many things, like just pieces of the puzzle together. So I just want to first say thank you so much for all that, brother. Incredible.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's all in the next book, so I hope I've whet your appetite.
I can't wait. I can't wait. So I took some notes, and let's just start from here. First, I want to talk about, 7th century BCE you're referring to. Well, in the Yuga cycle calendar, that's the beginning of the Kali Yuga, the 7th century BCE. It was when we fell from the Silver Age to the Dark Ages. So it was extremely interesting how it goes right on the same time when we shift in ages. But from what you were saying, another thing came up of the political connection to the ancient times. It was almost like spirituality and contact was decentralized. And then it became centralized, which is also a mirror reflection of the centralization of power, right? And now we're kind of going back to decentralization. So just wanted to see what your thoughts are on all that.
Oh, yes, I think you've got that absolutely right. I think it was part of a bigger pattern, and I'm really glad you said it in that context. That's a topic you know more about than I do, but it was exactly about that. We're going into an age of authority and a centralization of power, a disempowering of the grassroots, and a forgetting of all our abilities in contact and in finding wisdom.
Mm-hmm. I also got from what you're saying that after a little while of being oppressed, basically, like in the beginning, you started out like this. After a while of oppression, it kind of backfires because you can't oppress people to a certain extent, because then they start realizing they're being oppressed, and they revolted in many different ancient stories. And so to me, it's almost like this darkness, if it is a sentient awareness and conscious on this level, it's almost like they should know that eventually there's going to be a retaliation. So that goes to the whole understanding that the darkness is truly working for the light, that this is all, it's almost inevitable that through oppression, through taking away people's powers, eventually people are going to wake up to the truth and, you know, discover who they really are. So that's something also I got out of what you're sharing.
Yes, that's right. I think there's kind of a law of diminishing marginal returns if you're governing by violence. And I think, yes, first of all, you're oppressed and you don't notice. Then you're oppressed and you do notice. And then after that, you're oppressed and a new generation comes up and says, what's the point of living like this? And are willing to say things like, well, they can only kill us.
Mm-hmm.
And when you reach that point, of course, the oppressor's got no power left.
Right. It's almost like it gets to a point where death is almost welcomed on some level because you've been oppressed and tortured so much,
Yeah,
not only yourself,
right.
but your loved ones, your friends, right?
Exactly. You're thinking, well, what's the alternative?
Yeah.
You know,
And that's happening now.
Yes, you do see that. And you see that time and time again. The 80s was such an interesting period because we saw it on the TV, you know, where the crowd suddenly are not frightened of the military or the police.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I can still remember it's an ugly moment, the Ceausescu moment, but you just watch that and there's a certain inspiration in realizing this is a pivot moment in that country's history, and you can feel it in the dynamic of the crowd. They're not frightened anymore, and
Right.
now the leaders are frightened, and they were right to be so.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question here from Melanie, and it's probably a more of a general question, but let's see where you want to take it. Who started it all? So like within the text, you know, within all of the, how did the cycle begin?
Yes, I think that the way we govern and the way we colonize, I think we learned when we were colonized by ET visitors. That's my view. And I think the memory of that is there. In some ways, the memory of it is softened because we regarded them as our superiors and we called them our gods. But there's enough detail in the stories for us to go back and realize what that actually was, what we're being told. So I think that when the ET colonizers went home, I think in some instances they did exactly what we did, which is they've set up all the systems and they now just say, well, you can now make a local the governor, you can now make a local the chief of police and the senior judge, but all the systems are all already there. So I think we learned these patterns from other civilizations. And looking back, and I do a little bit of this in the Scars of Eden, I think we can look back and realize there have been different interventions at different times. And we really have to decide whose cue we want to take up. Do we want to take up the cue of the violent colonizers, or do we want to take up the cue of the nurturers of civilization? Because we had that spectrum of experience. Let's take our pick more thoughtfully. And that might sound ridiculous and like a theoretical, but if we just apply that to farming, for instance, two different models of farming, one which is destructive and oppressive and poisonous, and another that's empowering and local and healthy. Well, we, the people, would make one choice, I think. Those who are accustomed to serving those at the top of the tree would make another because it's profit driven, so on and so forth. So I think you break it down to different areas, and we really can choose which intervention we want to follow in the footsteps of, whether we're going to follow in the militarizing intervention that leads to petrochemical farming, so on and so forth, or if we follow the Asherah example, which leads to natural, organic, rotational combination farming, where the farmer can seed next year's harvest with the harvest of this year's. I mean, it is a choice, and those models are clashing right now, and people, as best they can, are trying to make their choices. And I think our ancestors have told us enough to equip us for those kinds of decisions.
Right. So you're saying that there were various forms of paleocontact, and there were harmonious ones, and that the Ashara one was a story of harmony. So it's basically what imprint do we want to go with, and how we're going to utilize that in order to restructure society, right?
Yes, that's right. That's
So,
exactly right. There's an interesting carving that was found. I'm trying to remember where it was found. That has Yahweh and Asherah side by side,
wow.
and it's almost as if they are the two poles of paleocontact: colonizer, the nurturer. And I think we do really have that freedom to choose. And it's not just we've got this book of theory or this book of theory. We do have company. And I believe what the writer said in 1 John 4, that we have company that's willing to communicate with humanity, not just via government.
Right.
And so if we're looking to make choices, you know, at a personal level, a family level, a local level, we're not just living in a cone of silence. We have help, and we have the help of our ancestors to prepare us as well.
Mm-hmm. So Melanie's saying, but who do you think created the ETs?
Well, I am a believer in Plato's grand vision of creation, and it ties in with a modern theory called panspermia. Panspermia is the idea that life in the cosmos is the rule rather than the exception, that we should expect to find it just as much as we should expect to find stars and planets, and that the genetic coding for biological conscious life is actually disseminated throughout the cosmos, that whenever that coding lands in an hospitable environment, which basically means a planet with water, it will generate forms of life similar to the ones that are on this planet. So that means that all life in the cosmos is related and comes from the same source. And that's really just a nuts and bolts version of how Plato talked about the origins of the cosmos. So it's not that there's a puppet master creating different kinds of being. It's that we have a cosmos full of beings. It's part of the nature of the cosmos. And some civilizations are older than others. Some have better tech than others. And some are more spiritually and emotionally rounded than others, which I think is us, which is why we are so interesting to some of our neighbors. And so we're all cousins ultimately. So it's simply older civilizations that are turning up, but we all come from the same source. We all come from the same genetic coding, which is part of the properties of the cosmos, just as much as the properties of light and the law of gravity.
Mm-hmm. You know, I've often heard, you know, in over the last decade or so, that we put our own personality traits on our gods, right? Like a vengeful god and different types of personality traits that we have on Earth. And from what you've explained today, it's almost like that these beings came down and they had these personality traits, and we kind of adopted it. That they were in essence, they were our fathers and mothers, right? They were the ones that seeded us and
Yes.
created us. So instead of looking at it as in there's this God and we're portraying these beliefs on it, we can even see it as that these beings came down to Earth. We thought of them as gods, and then we started basically acting out the same way that they were, you know, imposing
Yes,
themselves on us.
that's exactly right. And in the Sumerian version of that story, there's a very interesting detail to it, because in the Sumerian story, it's not just that advanced cousins came and dominated the population that was already here. They came and they genetically modified the population that was already here so that
Right.
we would be more governable. And it wasn't just any old Anunnaki DNA that they used to splice with ours. The Sumerian story says they took the DNA from a being called Kingu. And they used that genetic information to combine with what we would call primate DNA to produce a species who could be easily conquered and governed. The reason they picked Kingu is that he was an Anunnaki, but he'd been defeated by the ones who were running the show. Perfect. Perfect. Because he's got some of the advantages we want the humans to have, be a bit more intelligent, but this was one who could be dominated by the others, so we'll breed from him. And so that's how the Sumerians tell the story of an upgrade just up to the desired level where we can all be managed.
Wow.
It's a very specific way of telling a story that does repeat in cultures around the world.
Yeah.
It talks about the fine-tuning of our level of intelligence and consciousness through a process of what we now call genetic manipulation.